I'm the first person in my family to graduate college. I'm not talking one generation or two generations. I'm talking about 150 years, or at least as far back that I can trace to the 1870 census, when African Americans were recognized and accounted for. Scholars like Terry Kershaw talked about how education and critically examined its impact and influence on social mobility, recognizing that there's a long-standing history in America of anti-literacy laws that targeted black people. This contributed and added to why I'm the first in my family to graduate college. The first of its kind would be the South Carolina Act of 1740, where it criminalized the education of enslaved black people. If you were a white person who attempted to have or help a black person learn to read or write, you would be penalized and criminalized through the form of being fined and having to spend money. However, if you were a black person who were learning to read or write, you would be in prison or you would lose your life. William Goodell, in the American Slave Code and Theory and Practice, talked about how black literacy was a threat to the slave society and the slave culture, recognizing that whites in the colonies instituted these laws forbidding black people to read and write to ensure that they were impressed, and criminalizing anyone who assisted them in this process. Frederick Douglass, an African-American abolitionist, proclaimed to deny education to any people as one of the greatest crimes in human nature. Is to deny them the means of freedom and the rightful pursuit of happiness, and to defeat them is their very being and to deny it. It wouldn't be until 1799 that John Chavis would become the first African American to receive a college degree in the U.S., graduating from Washington and Lee University. He was a soldier of the Continental Army in 1778 and studied under John Witherspoon, who was one of the signers of the Declarations of Independence. You know, W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the leading black scholars and the first African American to earn a PhD at Harvard, reflected on his work in Souls of the Black Folks that the South believed an educated Negro is a dangerous Negro. And you know what? The South was wholly wrong, for educating among all kinds of men enables them to strive and be successful. My grandmother was just older than Linda Brown in 1954, when the Supreme Court justice ruled racial segregation of children in public schools to be unconstitutional in the landmark Brown versus Board of Education case. Linda was a little black girl whose father, Oliver Brown, responsible for this historical moment in time, took up the fight to make sure that his daughter would have access to a better quality of education when she was rejected admission into a school in Kansas in 1950. That pursuit of educational opportunities, and once more, as Douglass referred to, the righteous and rightful pursuit of happiness. You know, it would be Rudy Bridges at the age of 6 in 1960 that would take this case on head first and challenge its integrity, being the first African American student to integrate elementary schools and schools in the South. However, that pursuit was met by a lot of opposition, a lot of resistance, a lot of challenges. And while she was bullied, abused, and rejected, and faced the type of adversity that was also life-threatening, her and her mom would have to be escorted by U.S. Marshals to school every single day. Her experiences would be shared by many others, including my grandmother and members of my family who currently and previously resided in the South. This would influence many, many members of my family to migrate from the South and be a part of what was considered to be the Great Migration, or the Great Migration of Blacks, a movement where more than 6 million African Americans would leave the South for the Northwest, Northeast, Midwest and West, between 1916 and 1970. Half of my family made it to Texas and said that's far enough. The other half went all the way to California in hopes of escaping the grips of the Jim Crow South and the racism that existed. However, when they arrived to Los Angeles in search of that better world, they recognized, similar to the education systems, there is a long-standing history of systemic oppression and racism, and it reared its ugly head in other ways. One way became the drug trade and the war against drugs, and the CIA's involvement in the Nicaragua Contra, where folks out of Los Angeles would be utilized to sell drugs to fuel these wars, and then would invoke policies such as the war on drugs launched by President Nixon in the 1970s and influenced the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act that created a 100-to-1 crack and cocaine disparity. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, about 2 million people in the nation's prisons and jails are currently incarcerated, which is a 500% increase over the last 40 years. The challenge is these systems, similar to the education system that perpetuate the disenfranchisement of black people, have established a position where about 1 in 3 black males will find themselves incarcerated, accounting to be the highest among all races and genders. And unfortunately, my family and members of my family, such as my father and others, would fall victim to that. This would lead me to be raised by a single mother, living on welfare, living in housing subsidies such as Section 8, and by the age of 14, witnessing close friends be involved in drug violence, gang violence, killed and incarcerated, leaving me with no positive role models or guidance to navigate. I was affected by this system. By the age of 14, I was a high school dropout for 2 years. But again, I recognized that there was value in education. So compelled by God and a voice and higher calling, I moved to Washington State. I took the Greyhound bus, 26 hours, just to close on my back in search of a better future. I arrived to meet my younger brother and his mother, re-enrolled in school. And although I was out for 2 years, I was determined to do whatever it took to earn that education, because even though I didn't have context, I recognized its value. After re-enrolling in high school, I had to redo my junior year. I took 20 classes my senior year and earned a 3.9 GPA for those 20 classes. And it was at that point, as ludicrous as the idea seemed to me, I had great people that came to me and said, have you ever considered college? Now again, I say all this to recognize that no one in my family had ever considered college, had never been in college. And it was due to many factors such as these systemic oppressions and challenges that we've navigated socially due to our identities and how we are here to navigate this country. But I undertook the challenge regardless of how arduous the task was going to be. Took the SATs, got letters of recommendations, and did everything I could to apply, and I did. And you know what? I was rejected, but I was determined to say whatever it took, I was going to make it happen. Continued the appeal process and did everything possible. And I recognized that my belief was correct, that my life had a greater calling, and I was eventually admitted into college. Now, this is why my personal journey, and historically I recognize, is so significant for me to be the first to graduate from college. Now, today I'm committed to addressing those injustices, to make sure that those barriers that exist are not there to challenge others that carry my similar identities. And also, in my 15 years of work as a college administrator, I work to make sure that I'm fostering a culture that celebrates diversity, inclusion for all people, for all students, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, ability, socioeconomic status, age, or spirituality. More specifically, making sure that I serve as that mentor and that role model that I didn't have, and mentoring hundreds of young men of color to help them navigate the educational systems that exist regardless of their backgrounds that they're coming into. I do this work alongside organizations like the Student African American Brotherhood and Brother to Brother organization that since 1990 have been national leaders and establishing systems to support men of color who embark on this post-secondary education journey. I recognize that although there's more of us in college than there were during the times of John Chavis, it's important to recognize critically that scholars like Sean Harper articulate only 1 in 3 black men that enter college actually graduate. More work needs to be done. Educational environments are a microcosm of society, and they are not exempt from the larger challenges and systemic oppression that is being faced globally. Now, it's important that as I contemplate and reflect on how my identities are being oppressed, largely in the social context, that I also recognize the dominant identities that I hold and have an opportunity to learn more about how I can identify and support those whose identities are equally or more disenfranchised, and be able to use my positionality to support and uplift their voices. Patricia Hill Collins argues how black women in America uniquely are positioned to navigate 2 exceptionally powerful systems of oppression, that being their race, similar to me, and their gender. Recognizing that this is being referred to as intersectionality. You know, it took almost 230 years since the establishment of the Supreme Court as a representative to have, finally, a black woman be another first. This being in 2022, when Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson would be sworn into the Supreme Court. These injustices that continue to persist mean that I have to make sure I be a part of someone who can take on the fight to end oppression struggle. And what comes to mind as I recognize how I need to use my voice to support other underrepresented groups, the first thing that comes to mind is the word access. Now, access is more than just ability to acquire or obtain. I think about access as an acronym, with A being we need to be able to recognize the anti-blackness. The anti-blackness that LaToya Brackett recognizes as a framed of system and social disregard for black life directly correlating to settler colonialism and the historical mistreatment of black people. I'm talking about C, the C that Kimberly Crenshaw identifies in critical race theory as being a significant and integral practice in interrogating the role of race and racism in society that has emerged from the legal community but is very real in academic scholarship. I also recognize in pursuing this actness, we need C, Christ. We need Christ to come in and be of support. The Christ of Revelation 1:14-15, who identify and recognize the physical being of someone similar to Rudy Bridges, who would have also experienced similar hardships if he lived in the time of Jim Crow racism. We need E, equity. Equity that ensures the regard and recognition and value of protection of all people. And I believe that the scripture is key for us to be able to identify that. That's Zechariah 7:10, which states, "Do not oppress the widow or the fatherless or the stranger or the poor or the oppressed. Neither imagine evil in your brother's heart. Rather, fight against and fight hard to dismantle that other S, that last S, the systemic racism and oppression." It's genuinely my belief that if we address access, while I and many others stand before us today, many, many years later, as being the first, we can ensure moving forward, we won't be the last.